Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and tonight on Forgotten Mysteries, I have for you Scared to Death by George Bagby. And I have to say, I do like this sort of abstract, expressionist, kind of terrified looking man, something out of de Kooning, or maybe even, like Edvard Munch, the infamous scream of anxiety and depression, all that other good modern angst. It's a little overstated. There's really not a lot of scaring to death going on in this book, but I guess it's a pretty effective cover. Before I get into George Bagby, though, I want to tell you a little something about this book, which is that this is a book club edition. And often, collectors of books will look down their noses at book club editions because, admittedly, they are rather cheaply bound. The paper is usually pretty low quality. A lot of them have the same typesetting and the same interior design, and they just don't feel built to last the way a publisher's edition does. But despite this being a book club book, it has some really good production qualities. It's got nice thick paper. You can see it's got a colored edge, which means more of an investment, more that the publisher had to pay. And even on the title page, you can see that they invested in a second color, this blue, which is going to cost extra money. And the binding itself is pretty sturdy. It's a pretty sturdy binding. So this is a nice book club edition, in contrast to some of the book club editions that were put out in the 70s and 80s, which were pretty low quality in terms of the physical product, even if the content was good. So let me tell you a little bit about George Bagby. He was a very prolific writer, more than 50 novels to his credit. His real name was Aaron Marc Stein, but he wrote most of his books under the pseudonym of George Bagby, and he pulled off a little bit of a trick in that the narrator's name is also George Bagby. So your narrator, George Bagby, is publishing a book under his own name, George Bagby, even though that's not his real name. So my personal experience with George Bagby, I'm just going to come right out and say this, is I read two of his books a few years ago, and they were awful. I mean, not even mediocre. They were bad. One of them was called Two in the Bush, and the other was called The Garbage Collector. And that was published under Stein's own name. I got done reading these books and I thought, how on earth did these books get published? They're so amateurish. They've got nothing. They've got nothing for you except ridiculous plots that don't really go anywhere. And I just thought, well, okay, I gave Bagby the old college try, and he's just not right for me. But then the way I came by this book, which I have to keep holding up, is I was buying another book on eBay that I really wanted, and it was being sold as a lot of 3. But the price was really reasonable, and I figured I'm getting 3 books for the price of 1. The second book was by a writer I didn't know much about, Gavin Black, and I read that book and loved it. Definitely have to review some Gavin Black for you on this channel at some point. And the other was this George Bagby book, and I thought, I'll keep it on the shelf. At some point, I'll read a couple of pages and, either decide it just, off it goes to Goodwill, or I'll give Bagby one final try. And I did decide to give him the final try, which is why I'm sitting here before you tonight. And I have to say, this book was pretty good. I admit I opened it with an attitude because I thought, I was like kind of on tenterhooks thinking, oh, I'm so ready for this to suck. But it didn't. And I think maybe an explanation is this is a fairly early career book for him when a lot of writers are doing their best work. And those other books that I read that I mentioned were late career books. And, a lot of writers late in career, they've run out of steam, they've run out of ideas, they feel like they've done what they can do. And the books just seem very pedestrian and, not particularly, almost as if the author was on autopilot. But that's not the case here. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. So it's told in first person by George Bagby, but he's not the investigator. The investigator is the head of homicide in the New York City Police Department, Inspector Schmidt, affectionately known as Schmitty. Smitty. And affectionately known is a good phrase, I think, because people do like him because he's a good investigator, knows a lot of people, gets along well with people, and is just sort of a character you can look up to because he is a good guy. So George Bagby kind of serves as his tag-along. But, unlike Hastings, in the Agatha Christie books with Hastings and Hercule Poirot, or, say, Archie with Nero Wolfe, often they'll say something or do something or bring information back to the investigator. Or in the case of Hastings, he can be kind of a dim bulb, but he's a gentleman and he's a good narrator, whom you can trust. And even though he'll say things that maybe aren't, the quintessence of brilliance, some of the things that he says will get Poirot thinking down, a particular path and will be helpful. That's not the case here. George Bagby has nothing to offer. Not an interesting insight, not a humorous observation. It's almost like a publisher paid him to follow Smitty around and do nothing but record his exploits. But despite George Bagby having, no role other than reporter of events, in this book, he is a good reporter. And it all starts out, the initiating incident is pretty interesting. Bagby and Smitty are sitting in a car, in a police car in Manhattan, and all of a sudden they see a cab in front of them, sort of parked at the curb. The passenger door on the right side gets pushed open and some dude gets pushed out and he's beaten and bloody. And fortunately, Smitty and Bagby are in the right place at the right time. They get him to the hospital. He's kind of beaten up, but his life isn't in danger. And the victim starts lying and equivocating sort of right from the beginning. So their antennae go up. Something's not right. They go back the next day. He's changed his story. They can't get straight answers out of him. At the same time, they're sort of figuring out that this cab might have been stolen, and they start investigating the cabbie, who inexplicably leaves his cab really unattended to for an hour or two at a time so he can sit and watch the game at a local bar. And the plot actually ends up being rather clever with some good twists that you don't see coming, and then a satisfying ending that proved, at least to me, that Bagby could write a traditional mystery novel and do a pretty good job with it. I guess the center suffers a little bit from that drag or that lag that can happen, where you sort of feel like maybe 20 or 30 pages could have been cut. But for the most part, it's an engaging read. It's a first-person narrative, which for me, are always sort of fun and easy to read, or almost always. And so I closed the book and I thought, wow, I'm glad I gave Bagby that third chance. Whether I go out looking for more by him, I don't know. But I think if I do come across books in serendipitous locations, I look at the copyright page, and if they're from the 50s or 60s, I might pick it up. If they're from the 70s or 80s, I might not. And that's probably the best advice that I can give you, sitting from my, sort of limited perspective of having read now 3 of his books, but certainly not all of them. He was elected as a Grand Master by the Edgar Committee, so clearly he had the respect of his fellow writers, and I would be interested to know, if anybody out there in YouTube land has read any other books by him and would like to recommend them on this channel, and it's rather few viewers. But we don't do it for the views, we do it for the love of talking about books, because I have no one else to talk about these books with. Last thing, a little more bit of publishing history, is there's a mini essay on the back cover called The Pleasures of Reading Mystery Stories, and it's by Howard Haycraft. And it closes by indicating that this is a selection of the Dollar Mystery Club, which I come to find out was actually a book club in the 50s where they did nice book club editions for $1. So you could get a new first run mystery not published anywhere else for $1 for a hardback. And I can only imagine, what a boon that would have been to people who like to buy books but couldn't necessarily afford publishers' prices or full cover price at a bookstore. The Dollar Mystery Club, however, was different from the Mystery Guild that I belonged to in the 70s and 80s. Those books were also priced really reasonably, but they were produced with much lower production values, so they're a little flimsy now. I mean, they could never be circulated by a library because they'd fall apart within, 2 or 3 readings. But I'd like to give a shout out to the book clubs that I grew up with, because they introduced me to so many writers that I still read and enjoy, so many different genres. I do like a bunch of different genres, although I don't really talk about them here. And it was just great to, be able to get a catalog every month of great new books and, order one that I could afford. And, I grew up in the suburbs, and we had a couple of pretty large bookstores. Unfortunately, the people who ran both those bookstores were not nice. People didn't like them. You didn't have a good atmosphere when you went in there. And it was well known, as Maharamatsu would say, it was well known that these people were jerks. So they really didn't do any favors for their business. And, they sent people like me into the arms of the book clubs. And that's partially how I got to where I am today. So thank you for listening. Check out George Bagby if it sounds like he might be your cup of tea. And I will see you next time. Thank you and good night.